Hello and welcome to the November 2021 podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name's George Miller, and my guest this month, making a return visit to the podcast, is Philip Golub, who's Professor of Political Science, Political Philosophy and International Relations at the American University of Paris. Philip has a piece in this month's edition of the paper entitled Wall Street's Unlikely New Romance with China. Unlikely, if you recall the rhetoric of the Trump administration, when the emphasis was on decoupling the US and Chinese economies through tariffs, barriers, and all-out trade war. On the 10th of May 2019, Trump tweeted, "We have lost $500 billion a year for many years on crazy trade with China, no more." For all that bluster about trade, though, US investment kept flowing into China throughout the Trump years. It even increased, and China welcomed it. To the extent that The Economist could write in September last year, China is creating opportunities that foreign capital had not expected to come so quickly, if ever. Many observers focus on the decoupling between America and China. Yet for those managing the trillions of dollars that flow through global markets every day, the main trend looks more like coupling. In my conversation with Philip, we talk about how China squares this openness to Western capital with its increasingly aggressive, so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. But I began by asking him about the pace of what President Xi referred to as investment liberalization and facilitation in the past few years.
Instead of decoupling, we have witnessed over the past 5 years, 6 years, a deepening process of integration of China into the world financial system, not so much the world economy in terms of supply chains and transnational supply chains and other things of this type, which were actually targeted by Trump in his so-called trade war, but in terms of the movements of global finance, which are probably actually more significant because they actually tell you where where the main trends of world capitalism, of global capitalism, are actually heading. Despite geopolitical tensions, we saw over the past 5 or 6 years a intensification of flows into China, of financial flows into China, in all kinds of financial sectors, stocks and bonds, as well as the raising by China of capital on the New York capital markets, as well as other international capital markets. And interestingly enough, if you look at the statistics that are contained in the article, you have an acceleration and a deepening of China's integration into the international financial system during the Trump years, and with huge volumes of capital actually flowing into China. We're talking about at least, if you look at it cumulatively, $813 billion that have been invested by U.S. and other financial corporations, but mainly U.S.-based transnational financial corporations, firms, into China over the past decade or so, and that actually understates the actual volume of flow, since a not a small number of Chinese firms actually sell shares in offshore financial centers, notably the Cayman Islands, but not only. So the actual totals are probably well over $1 trillion that have been invested in Chinese stocks and bonds, securities of all kinds, over the past decade, notwithstanding the trade war. So the trade war, if you actually look at the just purely trade aspects of U.S. economic diplomacy, the course of economic diplomacy of the Trump administration, if you look at it from the standpoint of these financial flows, you just note very simply that with the attempt to restrict China, to keep China out of the international capitalist economy, or to push them in part out of the international capitalist economy, of which they are an essential component at this point, and have been for some time, failed quite miserably. This tells you all kinds of things about the limits of state power under conditions of globalization. It has all kinds of theoretical implications. It tells you a lot about the ways in which there's a significant inconsistency, indeed a contradiction, between international capital, transnational capital, and state power in the case of the United States, but also in the case of other states, something that we've known for some time, but here this illustrates it in a particularly clear way.
It also indicates that these multinationals, most of them or many of them US-based, had assessed the risk of putting money into China and decided it was a sound investment. In other words, they had sort of surveyed the terrain, they'd thought about the future, and they saw that as a good place to put their money.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly correct. And when they look at the world system, because capital is global and it traverses the entire world system, China during this entire period of time remained a primary and target of profitable investment. All the more so that China's growth rates, for the most part, remained strong over the past decade. There were some bumps in this, of course, but even during the second phase of COVID, Chinese economy recovered more quickly than the United States or the European economies, or indeed the rest of the world economy. And so finance considered China, all kinds of different domains of investment in China as being of great potential profitability. And we're talking about all kinds of different classes of investments here. We're talking about wealth management. We're talking about securities. We're talking about the ways in which the U.S. ratings agencies have moved into China. So yes, they considered China as a extraordinarily profitable, which it has been, of course, area of financial investments for the U.S., a major growth area, as they would call it, since the Chinese market is huge. And they clearly are expecting China to remain not only one of the two dominant poles of the world capitalist economy, they consider China to be one that has potentially more dynamism than others.
And I guess they also assessed that there wouldn't be any inhibition from structural impediments that the Chinese Communist Party might put in the way, or any political impediments from anything that the US government might enact. So they were presumably not just assessing it in terms of sort of pure investment in business, but also thinking about the bigger structural geopolitical issues that potentially come into play.
Yes. The Chinese state, the Chinese party state, has been signaling for the past 4 or 5 years to Wall Street, to the City of London, but to Wall Street in particular, and for reasons which relate to their understanding, to a sophisticated Chinese understanding that they can build up an important and influential constituency of actors in the United States that will themselves counteract the protectionist and geopolitical pressures of the United States. The Chinese leadership has been gradually opening up the financial sector and signaling to U.S. Wall Street actors that they are open for business, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah.
And these signals included the relaxation of controls. Starting 4 years ago, the relaxation of controls on investments by financial firms, U.S. financial firms, in the Chinese financial sector. And then rather quickly over time, as the Trump protectionist agenda became clearer, and as Biden's protectionist agenda was, reiterated and actually expanded Trump's agenda, that they've opened up new sectors to financial sectors to U.S. U.S.-based transnational capital. So all of this was a very sophisticated way of responding to the U.S. geopolitical efforts to limit China's reach, and it shows that they have a very acute understanding, the Chinese state, the state council, and the Chinese leadership have a very acute understanding of the tensions between transnational capital and the state, and what they can do with that. So those signals, of course, were picked up by the financial actors. Some of these signals were given directly, some of them were indirect. There have been constant interactions between very top-level Chinese officials and Wall Street firms over the years. They have been intensifying recently. The Chinese-U.S. Financial Roundtable, which was formed in 2018, precisely to counteract U.S. geopolitical pressures, and which is, brings together top Chinese officials and firms and top U.S. Wall Street figures and firms actually has been meeting regularly. It was interrupted a bit by the pandemic. So the Chinese government has been signaling and opening and doing things that gave Wall Street and other international financial centered firms a very strong, incentives to not only invest China, but to invest China more and more. All the more so that just recently they have given maybe the top 10 or 15 financial firms, Wall Street financial firms, the right to operate wholly owned financial subsidiaries in China, which was not the case before. So that's a big step forward in this campaign to woo Wall Street into China. And then on the other hand, Wall Street realized that Trump's trade agenda was not coherent, that the geopolitical risk on the U.S. side under Trump was not as great as the rhetoric, and they assumed that we were not heading towards war, and that short of a major conflict, short of a real geopolitical shock, that all the rest of this, basically the trade war, was fluff, hot air.
So if you're a US-based military technology company, you have to be extremely careful in your dealings with China, and perhaps even are dissuaded from having dealings with China. But if you're a Wall Street investment bank, really, the message is from China that you can step right up, and from the White House, it's all rhetoric.
Yes, I mean, from this, it's not under Biden. It's not so much rhetoric. Is that what you can constrain U.S. technology firms, whether they're military technology or non-military technology firms, you can constrain them in terms of the kinds of deals they make with Chinese firms. You can limit Chinese access, technology firms' access to the United States. You can limit Chinese firms raising capital in the New York financial markets by, launching initial public offerings. You can do stuff like that. But you can't, there is nothing in the current array of instruments that the U.S. state has to curb dealings with China to contain international or to curb international financial flows.
Yes.
There's 30 years of financial globalization and financial liberalization. Global financial liberalization have ushered in a 24-hour seamless global international financial system where capital is essentially entirely footloose, and it's largely concentrated in offshore financial centers. The U.S. government doesn't have direct control over that. And even though it can pressure, I suppose, it can pressure individual CEOs in various ways, it doesn't, they're not notoriously patriotic when it comes to investing their money.
I wanted to ask you, Philip, about what you call in your article China's Janus-faced posture, one part of which is what we've just been talking about, this controlled opening of China to global financial markets. And on the other hand, what people listening to this may be a little bit more familiar with, which is the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, where China has been sort of increasingly asserting its national interests, both regionally and more widely. I mean, do you see those as, well, you call them Janus face. So how does China manage to sort of pursue that twin track and render them somehow, maybe compatible is putting it too strongly, but at least pursue them simultaneously?
The geopolitical and diplomatic posture of the Chinese party state under Xi Jinping has been one of increasing self-assertion on the international stage more generally, but particularly in East Asia and in the Pacific. China has, under Xi Jinping, has made increasingly forceful claims that it has de facto historical rights to and sovereignty over the South China Sea. It has been building up very significant naval military capabilities to back up that claim and also to, eventually curtail U.S. operations in the South China Sea and in the Sea of Japan or the East China Sea, whichever you prefer. Its military buildup and its assertive nationalist rhetoric, very assertive nationalist rhetoric, have gone together, and there's no question that China's overall diplomatic posture has been actually quite extraordinarily aggressive in recent in recent years, vis-a-vis of East Asian countries, South Pacific countries, Australia, the United States, but also European countries, and including the European Parliament. Whenever anyone dares to criticize, anyone with a public face, that is, dares to criticize China's human rights record in Xinjiang and its policies in the South, expansionist policies in the South China Sea, or even the question the origins of the COVID pandemic and demand some type of accounting on the part of the Chinese government, the Chinese have responded with very virulent forms of propaganda, including cyber warfare kinds of actions. So wolf warrior diplomacy actually represents China's way to say to the rest of the world, and I'm putting this in kind of crude way, don't mess with us. We're now a great power again. We're a very great power indeed, and we will not tolerate encroachments on what we consider to be our spheres of influence and our ultimate national interests. They've done this while wooing capital, transnational capital. So these are two sides of an assertion of the ways in which they think they are going to both stabilize or expand their positions in the world capitalist economy on the one hand, with capital, and on the other hand, strategically, geostrategically, and politically, in diplomatic terms. Ultimately, these two faces do not cohere. Ultimately, if there's some kind of major geopolitical shock in the South China Sea or elsewhere, even if it's accidental, between the United States and its allies on the one hand and China on the other, this will, of course, upset the first part of the agenda, which is China's continuing opening to global finance. So, but for the moment, it's a sustainable dual posture. We've seen it is sustainable. They're doing both at the same time. If it continues down the track of geopolitical rivalry in coming years, at some point, the contradictory character of the two will become fully apparent, and it'll crack on one side or the other.
You emphasize that it is very much a controlled opening. It's not a sort of opening of the floodgates and letting all comers in, so that the access that's been granted, the government is very much in control of it. And you've mentioned one potential risk, that if they become too geopolitically assertive and some crisis is provoked, then that obviously would have consequences. But I wondered, are there other inherent vulnerabilities or risks in this even controlled opening up of the Chinese financial system in this way?
The Chinese government over the past year has begun reining in some of the major Chinese internet and communications corporations, Alibaba, Tencent, and now the list has expanded, and the state is actually reestablishing control over the major firms that emerged along with China's domestic liberalization efforts over the past 20 years. So, over the past 30 years, actually. So, they're doing this. They're not only showing, they're doing. The Chinese state can reclaim control. And that's true also of the foreign financial firms that are now currently investing in China, because actually their slice of the market is very small. In China, the banking system is dominated by huge commercial banks that are either state-run or state-linked banks. The Wall Street firms and other firms, while potentially making huge profits in their segments of the market, will not actually have any measure of control over the Chinese financial system. China has not removed capital controls. They're doing so very, very cautiously. They're dealing with international financial opening the other way around very carefully, and they can reclaim control. So I think that the risks for China of opening up to U.S. and other transnational capital is limited for China. I think that they've measured that risk, that they regaining control over their own domestic economic actors, the giant economic actors, and so I don't think that the state fears a loss of control. I think that what they fear more is domestic social turbulence because of the speculative bubbles that have built up in the Chinese economy over the past 25 years.
We began talking about the Trump administration. Maybe we should end on the Biden administration and its response. I think you were saying that really they had pursued a similar path and stepped it up somewhat to what Trump had begun. And I wondered if looked at it in its sort of widest context, and maybe this is overgeneralizing, but is China pursuing a long-term strategy, whereas the US is making rather late in the day tactical interventions that are not actually producing the results that it hopes?
Well, I think that under Biden you have a more coherent strategy than under Trump. So there are a set of reviews that have been initiated at in the executive branch by the National Security Council, working on an interagency basis to review all of the United States' supply chains in all kinds of different domains, from semiconductors to medical equipment. They're looking very carefully at the role of Chinese firms that have invested in the United States and U.S. firms that have invested in Chinese firms. They're looking at the military technological dimensions of that. So this review is actually something that reflects a bipartisan consensus within the national security institutions of the United States. Okay, it's not a political punching ball actually in that way. There's a consensus concern in the U.S. national security elite that China represents currently constitutes a challenge greater than the Soviet Union in terms of its potential over the middle term and long term, simply because China is integrated within the world capitalist economy, is a core part of the world capitalist economy, and is not shut out from it like the Soviet Union was. So there's a consensus there, and I think that's going to be pursued, and that whether this will have fundamental effects or not, what is clear, because it's going to be difficult to actually curtail some of the investment strategies, but what seems clear today is that we are entering into a new arms race between China and the U.S., and in that way, the United States, if you look at comparative advantages, the United States still retains very significant comparative advantages in terms of both technology and mobilization capacity of economic resources. So I don't think China has developed qualitative advantages that would allow it to negotiate all of this very easily with the United States. I think that China has established a balance of power that allows them to do things that they could not have even dreamt of doing in terms of their negotiating postures and their claims, including their territorial claims, even 20 years ago. So the balance has changed, but that it hasn't. The United States has not suddenly declined into a secondary power status. So I don't think anybody should be counting on that. I don't think the Chinese are actually counting on that. They have great domestic vulnerabilities. The U.S. has its own. The dangers here are clear, that accidents, mechanisms could be set into motion where a significant strategic crisis would derail everything. And then on the other hand, the trajectory of world capitalism is itself very uncertain now. So there are great uncertainties as to what all of this is going to play into in the future.
I was speaking to Philip Golub, who has an article entitled Wall Street's Unlikely New Romance with China in the November 2021 edition of Le Monde Diplomatique. You can read it at mondediplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can also read every edition of the paper going back 25 years, as well as exploring other resources such as the podcast archive and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of open access content online to entice you to become one. In the words of John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world, behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again soon for another interview with one of our contributors. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.